In the pantheon of American public figures whose names became synonymous with both triumph and tragedy, few loom as large or as complex as Robert Strange McNamara. Born in San Francisco on June 9, 1916, McNamara would live for 93 years, witnessing and helping to shape some of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century. His death in Washington, D.C., on July 6, 2009, marked the end of a life that had encompassed extraordinary success in corporate America, profound influence over American military policy during one of its most controversial periods, and a later chapter dedicated to global development and poverty alleviation. Yet for all his achievements across multiple spheres of influence, McNamara remains perhaps most remembered for his role as the principal architect of America's escalation into the Vietnam War, a conflict that would define not only his legacy, but also fundamentally alter American society's relationship with its government and military. The story of Robert McNamara begins in the American West during the Progressive Era, when the United States was emerging as a global industrial power. San Francisco in 1916 was a city rebuilding itself after the devastating earthquake of 1906, symbolically representing the kind of rational reconstruction and systematic planning that would later characterize McNamara's approach to management and policy. His middle name, Strange, was not merely coincidental, but rather prophetic of the complex and often contradictory nature of the man who would bear it throughout his life. McNamara's intellectual prowess was evident from an early age. He excelled academically, demonstrating the kind of analytical mind that would later make him one of the most influential figures in American business and government. After completing his undergraduate education at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studied economics and philosophy, McNamara pursued graduate work at Harvard Business School. There, he was exposed to the emerging science of business management and statistical analysis that would become the foundation of his professional methodology. Harvard Business School in the 1930s was pioneering new approaches to business education, emphasizing quantitative analysis and systematic management principles that promised to make business operations more efficient and predictable. The outbreak of World War II provided McNamara with his first opportunity to apply these management principles on a grand scale. Although his poor eyesight disqualified him from combat duty, he found himself in a position that would prove equally formative for his future career. McNamara was assigned to work on the development of logistical systems for bomber raids and statistical systems for monitoring troops and supplies. This work required him to think systematically about complex operations involving thousands of personnel and millions of dollars worth of equipment. The precision required in planning bombing missions, where small errors could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, reinforced McNamara's belief in the power of quantitative analysis and careful planning. During the war, McNamara worked alongside a group of young, analytically minded officers who would later become known as the Whiz Kids. This group included individuals like Charles Thornton, Tex Thornton, and R.J. Miller, all of whom shared McNamara's faith in statistical analysis and systematic management. Together, they developed new methods for analyzing military effectiveness, tracking supply chains, and optimizing resource allocation. Their work contributed significantly to the Allied victory, and the experience convinced them that the same analytical methods that had proven successful in wartime could be applied to peacetime business operations. After the war ended, McNamara and his fellow Whiz Kids found themselves in high demand in the corporate world. The Ford Motor Company, which had been struggling with inefficiency and outdated management practices, hired the entire group to help modernize its operations. McNamara's arrival at Ford in 1946 marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in American business history. The company that Henry Ford had built into an industrial giant had become hidebound by tradition and resistant to the kind of systematic analysis that McNamara represented. At Ford, McNamara quickly established himself as a rising star. He applied the same quantitative methods that had proven successful during the war to the challenges of automobile manufacturing and marketing. McNamara believed that every aspect of business operations could be measured, analyzed, and optimized. He introduced new methods for tracking costs, analyzing market trends, and evaluating the performance of different product lines. His approach was revolutionary in an industry that had traditionally relied on intuition and experience rather than statistical analysis. McNamara's rise through the ranks at Ford was meteoric. He moved from financial analyst to controller to general manager, earning a reputation for his ability to identify inefficiencies and implement solutions. His colleagues respected his intellectual rigor, though some found his analytical approach somewhat cold and impersonal. McNamara seemed more comfortable with numbers than with people, a characteristic that would later prove both an asset and a liability in his government service. One of McNamara's most significant contributions at Ford was his role in developing and promoting automotive safety features. At a time when the automobile industry generally resisted safety innovations as unnecessary costs, McNamara championed the development of safety glass, padded dashboards, and seatbelts. His advocacy for these features was based not on emotional appeals, but on statistical analysis of accident data that demonstrated their effectiveness in reducing injuries and fatalities. This approach to safety, grounded in quantitative analysis rather than regulatory mandate, reflected McNamara's broader philosophy that rational analysis could lead to better outcomes for both businesses and consumers. McNamara also played a crucial role in Ford's product development during the 1950s. He was instrumental in the development of the Ford Falcon, a compact car that proved highly successful in the marketplace. The Falcon represented McNamara's approach to product development, which emphasized careful market research, cost analysis, and systematic planning rather than the more intuitive methods that had previously dominated the industry. He also contributed to the development of the Lincoln Continental, which became one of Ford's most prestigious and profitable models. By 1960, McNamara's success at Ford had made him one of the most respected executives in American business. His appointment as president of Ford Motor Company on November 9, 1960, represented the culmination of his corporate career. At 44 years old, he became the first person outside the Ford family to lead the company, a testament to his exceptional abilities and the transformation he had helped bring about in the organization. Business Week described him as a prize specimen of a remarkable breed in American industry, the trained specialist in the science of business management, who was also a generalist moving easily from one technical field to another. However, McNamara's tenure as Ford's president would last only 1 month. President-elect John F. Kennedy, who had campaigned on a platform that emphasized the need to strengthen American defense capabilities, was looking for someone to serve as Secretary of Defense who could bring the same kind of analytical rigor to military affairs that McNamara had brought to business. The so-called missile gap, which suggested that the Soviet Union had gained a significant advantage in intercontinental ballistic missiles, had become a major political issue, and Kennedy wanted a defense secretary who could objectively assess American military capabilities and implement necessary improvements. Kennedy's offer to McNamara was irresistible, despite the personal and financial sacrifices it would require. McNamara saw the opportunity to serve as Secretary of Defense as a chance to apply his management principles to what he viewed as the ultimate challenge, ensuring American national security in an increasingly dangerous world. The Cold War was at its height, and the nuclear balance between the United States and Soviet Union made military planning more critical than ever before. McNamara accepted Kennedy's offer, beginning a chapter in his life that would bring him greater influence and ultimately greater notoriety than anything he had achieved in the corporate world. McNamara's appointment as Secretary of Defense in January 1961 marked the beginning of one of the most consequential tenures in the history of that office. He brought to the Pentagon the same systematic, analytical approach that had made him successful at Ford, but the challenges he faced were far more complex than anything he had encountered in the business world. The Department of Defense in 1961 was a vast bureaucracy managing a budget of tens of billions of dollars and overseeing military forces deployed around the world. The various service branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force, each had their own cultures, priorities, and ways of doing business, and they often competed with each other for resources and influence. One of McNamara's first initiatives as Defense Secretary was to implement what became known as the Planning, Programming, and Budgeting System, or PPBS. This system was designed to bring the same kind of systematic analysis to defense planning that McNamara had used at Ford. rather than simply funding military programs based on tradition or political considerations. PPBS required that every proposed expenditure be justified in terms of its contribution to overall defense objectives. The system required detailed cost-benefit analyses of different military options and forced military planners to think systematically about the relationship between means and ends. The implementation of PPBS was not without controversy. Many career military officers resented what they saw as McNamara's attempt to impose business methods on military affairs. They argued that warfare was fundamentally different from business, and that McNamara's quantitative approach failed to capture the human and psychological factors that were crucial to military success. These critics would later point to the failures in Vietnam as evidence that McNamara's analytical methods were inadequate for the complexities of modern warfare. However, McNamara's systematic approach did yield some significant successes during his early years as Defense Secretary. His analysis of the missile gap, for example, revealed that American fears of Soviet superiority were largely unfounded. Through careful examination of intelligence data and strategic assessments, McNamara determined that the United States actually maintained a significant advantage in nuclear weapons and delivery systems. This analysis helped to calm public fears and allowed for more rational defense planning based on actual rather than perceived threats. McNamara also played a crucial role in managing the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, perhaps the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. During the 13 days of the crisis, McNamara was one of Kennedy's closest advisors, helping to analyze Soviet intentions and evaluate American options. His systematic approach to crisis management, which emphasized careful analysis of alternatives and their likely consequences, contributed to the peaceful resolution of the crisis. McNamara's performance during the Cuban Missile Crisis enhanced his reputation as a skilled and rational manager of complex problems. However, it was McNamara's role in the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam that would ultimately define his legacy and overshadow his other achievements. When McNamara took office in 1961, American involvement in Vietnam was limited to a few hundred military advisors supporting the South Vietnamese government against communist insurgents. By the time he left office in 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were deployed in Vietnam, and the conflict had become the defining issue of American politics. McNamara's approach to Vietnam reflected his fundamental belief in the power of quantitative analysis and systematic planning. He saw the conflict as a problem that could be solved through the application of superior resources and rational strategy. McNamara believed that the United States, with its overwhelming advantages in technology, firepower, and economic resources, could defeat the communist forces in Vietnam if the right combination of military pressure and political incentives could be found. This confidence in American capabilities was not entirely misplaced. The United States did possess enormous advantages over its communist adversaries in Vietnam. American forces had access to advanced weapons systems, sophisticated communications equipment, and virtually unlimited supplies. The American economy was capable of supporting a major military effort in Vietnam while simultaneously maintaining prosperity at home. McNamara's statistical analyses showed clear American superiority in virtually every measurable category of military capability. However, McNamara's analytical approach had significant blind spots that would prove crucial to the ultimate failure of American strategy in Vietnam. His quantitative methods were better suited to measuring inputs than outcomes, and they failed to capture many of the political, cultural, and psychological factors that determined the effectiveness of military action. McNamara could measure the number of bombing sorties flown, the tonnage of explosives dropped, and the estimated number of enemy casualties, but these metrics did not necessarily correlate with progress toward achieving American political objectives in Vietnam. The disconnect between McNamara's measurements and the reality on the ground in Vietnam became increasingly apparent as the conflict escalated. Despite the enormous resources being deployed and the impressive statistics being generated, the communist forces continued to fight effectively, and the South Vietnamese government remained weak and unpopular. McNamara's confidence in American capabilities began to waver as it became clear that superior firepower and technology were not sufficient to achieve victory in Vietnam. One of the most controversial aspects of McNamara's approach to Vietnam was his reliance on body counts as a measure of progress. The McNamara Pentagon regularly reported statistics on enemy casualties, suggesting that American forces were systematically weakening their adversaries. However, these statistics were often unreliable and in any case failed to account for the enemy's ability to recruit new fighters and maintain morale despite heavy losses. The focus on body counts also created perverse incentives for American commanders, who sometimes inflated casualty figures or targeted civilians in order to improve their statistical performance. McNamara's growing doubts about the Vietnam strategy became evident in his private communications and internal government discussions, even as he continued to publicly support the escalation of American involvement. By 1967, he had become convinced that the current approach was not working and that a negotiated settlement was the only realistic way to end the conflict. However, President Lyndon Johnson was not ready to accept such a conclusion, and the tension between McNamara and Johnson became increasingly apparent. The internal conflict between McNamara's private doubts and his public position created enormous personal stress. He had built his career on the premise that rational analysis could solve complex problems, but Vietnam seemed to defy such analysis. The quantitative methods that had made him successful in business and in other areas of defense policy appeared inadequate to the challenges of counterinsurgency warfare in Southeast Asia. This realization was devastating to someone who had built his identity around his analytical capabilities. McNamara's departure from the Pentagon in February 1968 marked the end of one of the most significant tenures in the history of the Defense Department. His 7 years as Defense Secretary had seen the transformation of American military capabilities and the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam to unprecedented levels. His legacy at the Pentagon was complex and contradictory. On one hand, he had modernized defense planning and brought greater analytical rigor to military decision-making. On the other hand, his role in the Vietnam escalation had demonstrated the limitations of purely quantitative approaches to complex political and military problems. After leaving the Defense Department, McNamara faced a choice about how to spend the remainder of his career. He could have returned to the corporate world, where his reputation and experience would have made him highly sought after. Instead, he chose to accept the position of president of the World Bank, an international institution dedicated to promoting economic development in poorer countries. This choice reflected a desire to use his remaining career to address some of the world's most pressing problems and perhaps to find some redemption for his role in Vietnam. McNamara's appointment as World Bank president in 1968 represented a significant shift in the institution's priorities and approach. The World Bank had been created after World War II primarily to help rebuild war-torn Europe, but by the 1960s its focus had shifted to promoting economic development in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Under McNamara's leadership, the bank would undergo a dramatic expansion in both the scale of its operations and the scope of its mission. McNamara brought to the World Bank the same systematic approach that had characterized his work at Ford and the Pentagon. He implemented new methods for evaluating development projects, established clearer criteria for lending decisions, and dramatically increased the bank's lending capacity. During his 13 years as president, from 1968 to 1981, the World Bank tripled its loans to developing nations and became the world's largest source of development financing. More importantly, McNamara fundamentally changed the World Bank's approach to development. Previous bank presidents had focused primarily on large infrastructure projects such as dams, highways, and power plants. While these projects were important, McNamara recognized that they did not directly address the needs of the world's poorest people. He shifted the bank's focus toward rural development, education, healthcare, and other programs that would directly benefit the poor. This new approach was revolutionary in the world of international development. McNamara argued that economic growth alone was not sufficient to improve the lives of the world's poorest people. Unless development programs specifically targeted poverty reduction, economic growth might actually increase inequality and leave the poor worse off than before. This insight led to the development of what became known as the basic needs approach to development, which emphasized meeting the fundamental requirements of poor people for food, shelter, education, and healthcare. McNamara's leadership of the World Bank was not without controversy. Some critics argued that his emphasis on poverty reduction led the bank to support projects that were not economically viable. Others suggested that his systematic approach to development failed to account for the political and cultural factors that determine the success of development programs. These criticisms echoed some of the same concerns that had been raised about his analytical approach to military planning during his tenure at the Pentagon. However, most observers agree that McNamara's tenure at the World Bank was successful in achieving its primary objectives. The bank's lending increased dramatically, reaching developing countries that had previously had limited access to international capital. The focus on poverty reduction helped to establish development as a legitimate concern of international policy and influence the approaches of other donor agencies and national governments. McNamara's advocacy for the world's poorest people helped to raise awareness of global poverty and established moral arguments for international assistance that continue to influence development policy today. Perhaps most importantly, McNamara's work at the World Bank represented a personal transformation that reflected his evolving understanding of the limitations of purely technical approaches to complex problems. His experience in Vietnam had taught him that quantitative analysis, while valuable, was not sufficient for understanding problems that involve human behavior, cultural differences, and political dynamics. At the World Bank, he began to incorporate these insights into his approach to development, recognizing that successful programs required not just technical expertise, but also understanding of local conditions and respect for the autonomy of developing countries. Throughout his tenure at the World Bank, McNamara remained haunted by his role in Vietnam. The conflict continued to rage during his early years at the bank, and the eventual American withdrawal and the fall of South Vietnam in 1975 seemed to confirm the failure of the strategies he had championed. McNamara rarely spoke publicly about Vietnam during his World Bank years, but those who knew him reported that he was deeply troubled by the human costs of the conflict and his role in escalating American involvement. After retiring from the World Bank in 1981, McNamara entered the final phase of his career, which was characterized by increasing reflection on his past experiences and growing involvement in efforts to reduce the risks of nuclear war. He became associated with organizations such as the Ford Foundation and the Brookings Institution, where he worked on issues related to international security and arms control. This work reflected his growing conviction that the nuclear weapons he had helped to build up during his tenure as Defense Secretary posed an unacceptable risk to human survival. In the 1980s and 1990s, McNamara became increasingly vocal about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need for arms control agreements between the United States and Soviet Union. He worked with other former defense officials to promote dialogue between American and Soviet leaders and to develop proposals for reducing nuclear arsenals. This work was part of a broader pattern of reflection and partial recantation that characterized McNamara's later years. The most dramatic example of this process was McNamara's 1995 memoir, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. In this book, McNamara acknowledged that he and other American policymakers had been wrong about Vietnam and that the escalation of American involvement had been a mistake. The book was controversial because it represented McNamara's first detailed public discussion of his role in Vietnam and his first admission that American strategy had been fundamentally flawed. In retrospect, revealed that McNamara had become convinced as early as 1967 that the Vietnam War could not be won through military means, and that a negotiated settlement was the only realistic option. However, he had continued to publicly support the war effort even after reaching this conclusion, a fact that drew criticism from both supporters and opponents of the conflict. Some argued that McNamara should have resigned or spoken out publicly about his doubts, while others suggested that his memoir was an attempt to absolve himself of responsibility for decisions that had cost thousands of lives. Despite the controversy surrounding In Retrospect, the book provided valuable insights into the decision-making process that led to American escalation in Vietnam. McNamara's account revealed the extent to which American policymakers had misunderstood the nature of the conflict and the determination of their adversaries. He acknowledged that American leaders had failed to appreciate the nationalist character of the Vietnamese communist movement and had underestimated the willingness of the Vietnamese people to accept enormous sacrifices in pursuit of independence and unification. The book also revealed the degree to which the analytical methods that had made McNamara successful in business and other areas of government service were inadequate for the complexities of the Vietnam conflict. McNamara acknowledged that his faith in quantitative analysis and systematic planning had blinded him to important political and cultural factors that ultimately determined the outcome of the conflict. This admission represented a significant evolution in McNamara's thinking about the nature of complex problems and the limitations of technical approaches to solving them. In retrospect, was followed by a 2003 documentary film, The Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara, directed by Errol Morris. The film provided an even more personal and reflective account of McNamara's career and his evolving understanding of his experiences. The documentary's title referred to the uncertainty and confusion that characterizes decision-making during conflicts, and McNamara used the film to elaborate on the lessons he had learned from his various roles in government and business. The 11 lessons that McNamara articulated in The Fog of War represented a distillation of his thinking about leadership, decision-making, and the management of complex organizations. These lessons included the importance of empathizing with your enemy, the need to be prepared to re-examine your reasoning, and the recognition that rationality will not save us from the consequences of our actions. These insights reflected McNamara's growing understanding of the limitations of purely analytical approaches to complex problems and his recognition that successful leadership requires not just technical expertise, but also wisdom, humility, and moral courage. The documentary and McNamara's other late career reflections helped to rehabilitate his reputation to some extent, presenting him as a thoughtful and self-critical figure who had learned from his mistakes. However, many critics argue that these reflections came too late to undo the damage caused by his earlier decisions. The human costs of the Vietnam War, including the deaths of more than 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese, could not be undone by subsequent admissions of error. Throughout his later years, McNamara remained active in efforts to address global problems, particularly those related to nuclear weapons and international security. He continued to argue that the existence of large nuclear arsenals posed an unacceptable risk to human survival and advocated for substantial reductions in nuclear weapon stockpiles. This work reflected his growing conviction that the technical solutions he had championed during his government service were inadequate to address the fundamental challenges facing humanity. McNamara's later involvement in nuclear disarmament efforts was particularly significant because it represented a reversal of positions he had taken during his tenure as Defense Secretary. During the 1960s, he had overseen a substantial buildup of American nuclear forces and had advocated for maintaining American nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. His later advocacy for nuclear disarmament reflected his evolving understanding of the risks posed by these weapons and his recognition that technical superiority could not guarantee security in a nuclear age. The complexity and contradictions of McNamara's career make him a difficult figure to evaluate. His supporters point to his genuine accomplishments in business, his modernization of defense planning, and his humanitarian work at the World Bank. They argue that his mistakes in Vietnam were the result of circumstances beyond his control, and that his later reflections demonstrate genuine learning and growth. His critics, however, argue that his analytical approach was fundamentally flawed and that his role in escalating the Vietnam War overshadows his other achievements. Perhaps the most accurate assessment of McNamara is that he was a man of exceptional abilities who was shaped by the particular circumstances of his era. His faith in quantitative analysis and systematic planning reflected the optimism of mid-20th century America about the power of technology and expertise to solve complex problems. This faith was not entirely misplaced, as demonstrated by his successes at Ford and in some areas of defense policy. However, the limitations of this approach became apparent when applied to the complexities of Vietnam and other problems that defied purely technical solutions. McNamara's career also illustrates the challenges faced by individuals who hold positions of enormous responsibility during periods of historical crisis. The decisions he made as Defense Secretary affected the lives of millions of people and helped to shape the course of American history. The burden of such responsibility, combined with the limitations of the information and analytical tools available to him, created conditions in which even well-intentioned and highly capable individuals could make catastrophic errors. The evolution of McNamara's thinking over the course of his career provides insights into the process of learning and growth that can occur even in highly successful individuals. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and to reflect critically on his past decisions, while controversial, demonstrated a kind of intellectual honesty that is rare among public figures. This willingness to admit error and to learn from failure may be McNamara's most valuable legacy, providing an example of how individuals can continue to grow and contribute to society even after making significant mistakes. When Robert McNamara died in 2009 at the age of 93, he left behind a legacy that was as complex and contradictory as the man himself. His contributions to business, defense planning, and international development were substantial and lasting. His role in the Vietnam War remained controversial and painful for many Americans who lived through that period. His later reflections on his career provided valuable insights into the challenges of leadership and the limitations of technical approaches to complex problems. Perhaps the most important lesson from McNamara's life is the recognition that even the most capable and well-intentioned individuals are fallible, and that the consequences of their decisions can extend far beyond what they anticipate. His career demonstrates both the power and the limitations of analytical thinking, the importance of humility and leadership, and the possibility of learning and growth throughout one's life. These lessons remain relevant for current and future leaders who will face challenges that are every bit as complex and consequential as those that McNamara encountered during his remarkable career. In the final analysis, Robert McNamara was a product of his time and circumstances, a brilliant and driven individual who achieved extraordinary success and made catastrophic mistakes. His life story serves as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, demonstrating the heights that human intelligence and determination can reach, while also illustrating the tragic consequences that can result when analytical brilliance is not tempered by wisdom, humility, and a deep understanding of human nature. The complexities and contradictions of his career continue to provide valuable lessons for anyone seeking to understand the challenges of leadership in an increasingly complex and interconnected world.